and welcome to our webinar, Undue Familiarity, Do You Believe You Can Never Be Compromised?, sponsored by the National Institute of Correction. I am Leslie Lemaster with NIC, and I'll be serving as your host and the producer for today's webinar. You will notice as you join today that you're muted, and the voices you're going to be hearing are mine as your host and producer and those of your presenters. Your way of communicating with us is via the chat function, which is located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So to make sure that the chat is actually working for you, I want you to take a moment and find in the bottom of your screen a little icon that looks like a chat bubble. I want you to left-click that and engage it, and then a chat box should pop up in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Just to make sure that if you haven't tried it out already, please do chat to us where you're joining us from today and why you are interested in the topic at hand, which is undue familiarity in correctional settings. So please do send your chat to all participants from the drop-down menu to ensure that your chat is shared with all who are in the webinar. Just to let you know up front, today's webinar is being recorded, and you will have access both to the recording and to the slides from today's webinar once the webinar is captioned. There will be an announcement on the NIC website about when the recording and the slides are available. We want to make sure that the chat is working for you because you will have the opportunity for questions and answers, and the way we'll know what your questions are is that you will be chatting your questions to us and commenting as the webinar progresses. So without further ado, I would like for you to get to know some of your presenters that are going to be working with us today. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Evelyn Bush.
Why, thank you, Leslie, and good morning and welcome, everyone. It is with great anticipation that we give you an opportunity to hear about and chat about inappropriate conduct with inmates that we are calling undue familiarity. This topic is one that is near and dear to correctional culture because so many of you are in constant contact with inmates, not having a full knowledge and or training about what could occur. So the Prisons Division is very happy to present this to you today. And with that in mind, there was some history as to how this came about. So I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Donna Ledbetter, to give you a little insight. Donna?
Thank you, Evelyn. This project, this webinar was inspired by a constituent request resulting from the Data-Driven Librarianship in Corrections project. This project looks at how data can be used to enhance and improve library services for offenders and to achieve measurable outcomes. It's important to remember that the library is more than just books. It is a center for learning, self-development, family bonding, and more. And so this webinar is part of that based on the constituent request in terms of looking at staff who are working in the library, but also other staff such as volunteers who may have similar positions in working with offenders. Throughout this webinar, you will have the opportunity to pose your questions. As my colleague Leslie mentioned, please go ahead and enter those into the chat. I will be taking those questions, and when we get to the Q&A section, those questions will be presented to our presenter, who will be able to answer them at this time. Now I will hand this off to Leslie. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Donna. And we also want our main presenter to introduce herself. Susan.
Thank you, Leslie. My name is Susan Poole, and at the present time, I'm working as a criminal justice consultant. I'm also a 30-year veteran of the California Department of Corrections, where I retired in the year 2000 at the level of warden. Since the 1980s, I've provided services as a consultant to NIC, working on issues related to sexual misconduct. And I have done reviews along with my colleagues in 48 of the 50 states. So today I'm pleased to be able to share with you some of what we learned from those experiences.
So thank you so much, Sue. To get us started, let's do our first chat activity to get us revved up and rolling. So how engaged are you going to be in this webinar today? And we'd like for you to rate yourself on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 is I'm not going to be engaged at all the way up to 7, where I'm going to be incredibly engaged in this webinar. So, oh boy, we've got all kinds of things just tumbling in here really quickly, Evelyn. What kind of themes are you seeing in those rating numbers?
What I'm seeing is that people were not voluntold to be here, Leslie. They are here because they want to be. And I'm excited about all those 7s. There is one voluntold person, but that's all right. We'll convert you before the day is over.
I am seeing some 3s. I also saw a 6,795 person.
There you go.
Which was quite, right off the scale. So we do have people kind of all over the place, and I'm with you. I think we should convert them. So what we do ask you to do is be here and in the moment. So turn your cell phone face down, turn it off, mute it, close your email box, just engage with us. Oh, thank you, Jeremy. That's a decimal, not a comma. I like it. Thank you so much. So we've got some smart acres here on with us too, Evelyn. And just be with us, go with us. We're going to engage you. We'll want to know what you think about this subject matter at hand. We want to pull you into the moment. So we have lots of things and lots of places, don't we, Susan? Lots of places we're going today.
Absolutely, and I'm thrilled to see everybody online. So first of all, I want to applaud all of you for taking the time out of your schedule to participate in this exercise, because we often hear that staff are valuable resources, but whether you are a staff person or a manager supervisor, sometimes we don't pay attention to all of the tools that our staff need to be successful. So let's take a look at this issue from a broad perspective. If you take a look at the screen, you'll see a number of headlines. These were taken just right out of the news. And the reason we put this up is to share with you that wherever you may be across the country, you are not alone. Whether you are federal, state, or jail, or community corrections, these kinds of issues are present in all of our cultures. And it's important for us to feel that we are not alone. We have the same kinds of problems, but we also have the same kinds of solutions that are available to us. And the point I want to make as we go through, and I want you to listen for this carefully, is that staff sexual misconduct over familiarity often begins with policy violations. And you're going to hear me repeat that fact many, many times, because if our policies and our agencies are clear, and if staff are trained to that, and they are held to that standard, it's about accountability, because we hear manipulation a lot of the times, but manipulation only occurs when staff fail to follow policy or policy isn't clear. So it's your responsibility, though, to know what those policies are and to use the tools that you're given to appropriately and effectively, without wavering, do your job. So now let's take a reading on how you think your agency is doing around this issue.
Okay, so it's time for you to chat again. How engaged do you feel that your agency is in providing training around this subject matter on undue familiarity? How engaged do you feel that your agency is in providing training around this subject matter, where 1 is not at all engaged and 7 is incredibly engaged? Evelyn, what kind of numbers are you seeing in ratings?
Well, I'm kind of surprised at the number of 7s who are on the line, which tells me something. And we go all the way down to a 1, which is not engaged at all. There's an average going on here, though, Leslie. I'm going to go with an average of 5.5. What do you think?
Yeah, 5.5 to 4. I'm kind of somewhere in that mid-range.
Oh, there's a -2.
Oh, boy.
Well, I'm pleased to know that some of your agencies are out front of this issue, but regardless, it's something that needs to be constantly reinforced. And I want to remind you that the goal of this session is not to make you an expert on this subject, but rather to provide you some forewarning and some guidance about what to look for regarding professional boundaries. So let's look at our objective for this session. By the end of this interactive webinar, you will be able to identify behaviors that constitute undue familiarity, some red flags, and some strategies to avoid becoming compromised. So we're concentrating on defining undue familiarity because it is often the behavior that escalates into sexual misconduct, and that is illegal now in all 50 states and could certainly result in ending a career and going to jail. And we're going to talk about some of the dynamics and more specifics later on. We're bringing this to your attention because we have heard so many times people say, this could not happen to me. And I can tell you, after doing reviews in 50 states, everyone is vulnerable if they don't take the proper precautions. And that's something that we need to emphasize with new staff and continue to re-emphasize with our existing staff. So now I'm going to ask you why you think this is such an important issue.
All right, so here's another chat activity for you. Why do you think this is such an important topic? And for those of you who are attending in a group setting with a group of folks, we want to give you the opportunity to give us a group answer in chat. So just take a moment to have a quick discussion. Why do you think this is such an important topic? So, Evelyn, I'm seeing some definite trends in the answers. What are you seeing?
I am so proud of this group already. Safety is trumping the board here. Safety and security is popping up consistently. Now, there's some other things up there in terms of ethics and legal and boundaries are blurred and so on, but I'm really proud that this group was able to pick safety as the #1 reason. Anybody that's still typing, stop typing, because I already told you that was the high answer.
I want to reinforce what Evelyn just said and compliment you on your responses, and to also let you know that as we've seen the range of responses, many of them are things that I'm going to talk about anyhow. So what that tells me is that within your staff mix, there often are the answers to some of the questions if we would share this responsibility of helping our coworkers to be successful. We can't always rely on administration or policy because managers aren't present everywhere where these interactions take place. But if we see someone having a concern, we could certainly confront them about it. Sometimes when we ask this question, people think, well, don't people just know right from wrong? And you might be asking yourself that or have asked yourself that at some point in time. But trust me, issues are not black and white. We all have differing opinions about what's right or wrong, and some of that has to do with our value set, our personal values, and the way we were raised. So we can't make assumptions about our new employees coming in or the values that are held by anyone that we work with. So you've all provided some excellent responses. Now let's look at some of the responses that I'm going to share with you. Again, congratulations for those of you who said security, because that is the #1 issue. And I am always surprised when we do a review that staff often tell us if they saw someone that they thought might be in a compromising situation, they would not report it. And that just really floored me, because I'm sure in all of your policies you have something that says you have a duty to report. But staff give many reasons for why they think they shouldn't report. They don't want to harm someone's career. They don't want to be ostracized for being a snitch. That's inmate language, we know. And all of these reasons don't hold any water. Security is the number one reason. When we have people in a compromising position, it does compromise security, because if they are doing something other than being on their regular post, they are not there to provide the proper security that's there. So even when we have situations where unions are involved, sometimes they get involved in saying, you know, we're not going to take on employees. We're not going to ruin someone's career because of a suspicion. These things all need to be investigated. It's also illegal in all 50 states. It violates constitutionally guaranteed rights. We don't have any ability as staff to impose a penalty beyond what the law says is appropriate for the people under our care. It victimizes those that are already vulnerable. And by that we mean research has told us that many of the people that we supervise in our prisons and systems have a history of victimization. And if we treat them in the same manner that they were previously treated, we further violate them as individuals, and that is not our purpose as professionals. It creates a hostile work environment because, just as we saw in the headlines, the conduct of a few employees will paint your agency with a negative light. And then those of us who are doing our jobs and are consummate professionals get painted in a negative way. It also exposes your agency to civil and criminal liability, and that's a very key issue. It undermines public support because all of what the public knows about us, for the most part, is what they read in the newspapers. And if that's all that's published about us, that's their opinion. And it could also diminish legislative support. So now we're going to take a look at a scenario that sometimes plays out in our institutions in one form or another. Evelyn and Leslie are going to role play an inmate and a staff conversation.
All right, Inmate Jones, it's time to get ready for your work assignment. Hey, you know what? You're always late. Let's go.
Give me a minute.
You don't have a minute. I'm fed up with having to force you to be in time for work.
Wow, somebody woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Hey, did you have a fight with your wife or something?
Nah, just another stupid argument about my wife's overspending. This is getting to be too much.
So an interesting little conversation, and it may not go down exactly like that, but what I want you to hear in that is the level of communication that existed between the inmate and the staff. It sounds like the staff member may have been having a difficult situation at home, and they brought that situation to work. And it colored the way in which they responded to the inmate, and it also shared personal information, which in your policies we say not to do. And it's very easy to move from being a nice person out in the community and generally speaking to thinking that your communication with inmates has no problems. You never tell inmates your personal problems someone has written. That is correct. But we have to reinforce that with staff because sometimes in the press of business, that gets lost in what we're doing. And we're just being nice people, and we don't know what the motivation is for the inmates that we are exchanging conversations with. So here's some things to consider. Confinement settings are complex. Sometimes these inmates come from the same community where we work. I can think about many scenarios where in small communities, these are people that you know because you know their family members. Sometimes if the inmates have been at your facility for a long time, there becomes a comfort level or complacency, I think someone said earlier. That's an important thing to remember. You're going to hear me repeat some themes over and over, and part of that training for your staff has to be spaced repetition. We have to tell them in orientation, we have to tell them in our policy, we have to tell them in annual training, and we have to confront behavior as we see it, because these small violations become bigger violations. Staff may have their own vulnerabilities, and we're going to talk about that in more detail later on. But if staff has personal problems, and none of us is immune to that, we never know when our life circumstance is going to change, and that could put some pressure or stress on us that we have to deal with in our personal lives, and it could color our perceptions at work. And last but not least, there's a closeness in age between staff and inmates. We have 5 generations at work right now in our agencies. And sometimes that gets to be a problem because we identify with persons who are in that same age group as opposed to our profession. So, Evelyn, did you have some feedback on this issue?
You know what, Sue? I did want to mention the closeness in the culture. You know, inmates have 24 hours to study us. And so as much as some of the chat coming through is, you know, they're not, you got to be professional, you don't share information, we are human too. And we bring what we bring to life. And so it's a daily challenge to, like Sue said, there's a boundary which is appropriate that you have to leave at the door. You just had an exchange with one of your children. Now you got to cross this other boundary and make sure that you don't continue at that same mental level. So this switch is not sometimes as easy as we all think it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Someone wrote in the comments, the inmates are not your friend. That is correct. But let me just tell you, I have seen situations where an employee is going through a divorce, for example, and they're feeling very distraught. They have been put out of the house. They don't have access to their children. All kinds of things are going through their mind. And at that point in time, an inmate may be observing that if they know something about their personal history, and they may take advantage of that in terms of treating the person well. And sometimes our egos get in the way. If we're not feeling good about our relations in the community and an inmate is paying attention to us, we could easily fall into the slippery slope. So no, they are not our friends. We have to keep reminding people about that. But if we see someone in difficulty, we also need to be there as a source of support for our fellow employees. And finally, as we hire in some agencies staff as young as 18 years old, and they may not have the life experience and maturity to work with a worldlier and more experienced population without proper direction. So there's nothing wrong with that. There are many competent 18-year-olds, but there are also many who don't have the life experience to be able to work in this environment. And this can create a challenge in maintaining professional boundaries. It's important to remember, in a confinement situation, there is no relationship of equals. Based on staff, regardless of your position, you're in a position of power over the inmate. So there's no such thing as a staff-inmate consensual relationship. And please make note of that, because that's a point that you need to reinforce as often as you can with staff. So now we're going to talk about what you think about this issue.
So here's another chat opportunity for you. And so tell us, what do you think constitutes undue familiarity? Chat your ideas to share with all. And for those of you who are in groups at your location, please do have a quick conversation. What do you think constitutes undue familiarity? Here's your opportunity to share that with us.
These are some really excellent responses.
So, Evelyn, what kind of themes are you seeing in responses here?
Well, it's interesting because people are using words, too, that they probably couldn't define. So compromising, instead of telling me what does that behavior look like, okay? So if your supervisor said, well, I don't want you to compromise yourself, and you walk away, did you know what that meant? And so Sue is going to get into more detail so that we understand what these behaviors look like. Let me just point out, somebody said inmate knowing your first name. Well, if staff are calling you down the hallway and they're calling you by your first name, all the inmates are going to know that. So again, it's not that they know your first name. So there's some very good stuff up here, and everybody can see it. The biggest thing is sharing the personal information. The question becomes, do they always get it from you? All right.
Thank you, Evelyn. So your agency policy should guide ethics, values, and behavior. But as we've talked about, it isn't always clear. And I think Evelyn was trying to reinforce that point. So let's take a look at some behaviors. The first one says making sexual jokes with inmates or in front of inmates. And sometimes if we have a sexualized work environment with staff, we've gone into places and we found things that were posted that were inappropriate. If we are the proper role models, we set the standard for the professional boundaries, using inmate nicknames and instead of proper terminology dictated by policy. Again, it gets back to policy. Now, I'm going to tell you one little short story about policy as an example, because Evelyn mentioned that we use terminology sometimes, and just as things aren't black and white, we don't always know that the message that we are communicating gets across in the way that we intended. We often ask about touch policy, for example, and we've had people tell us, oh, yes, we have a no-touch policy. I said, so can you shake an inmate's hand in a recognition ceremony? Well, no, that's okay. But some will say, oh, no, we can't touch them even that. We've had someone say, I work for the maintenance department and someone fell off of a ladder and I wasn't going to grab them because I might be accused of harassment. And my point is not to tell you where you should be on this policy, but give clarification about what your policies actually mean, because there's no policy that's going to specifically delineate every circumstance. Common sense has to prevail, and when we say common sense, there again, we fall into a gray area because they aren't always equally shared values. Discussing personal issues, many of you said that, allowing an inmate to have special privileges. If you can't do it for every inmate, then it shouldn't be done at all. Feeling you can trust an inmate to have your back. Staff are there to have your back. That is, the inmate is not only not your friend, they're not your support system within the institution. So I want to remind you that no matter how good your policy directives are, it may not cover every situation that you encounter. A good guideline to keep in mind is if what you're about to do is not specifically addressed in policy or expressly forbidden, or even if you feel uncomfortable about it, seek guidance from your supervisor or a veteran staff member before you take any action. Reinforce this with staff every opportunity that you get. So let's take a look at some more issues. Some of you may work in isolated areas, and that's a part of the job that you don't control. What you do control, however, is making sure that you don't relax your personal interaction with the inmates to the point where professional lines are blurred. Sometimes there's a short distance between being nice and compromising your professional boundaries. When we work in close proximity with inmates, particularly in somewhat normalizing environments like education or the library, for example, or even in our work areas, there's a tendency over time to become familiar and complacent. The staff member understands the inmate's behavior patterns, but they also understand yours. And you may feel so comfortable with them that while you're talking on the phone to other people, you're not aware that they're in earshot and hearing things or information that they maybe shouldn't have. So doing special favors for inmates, contacting outside family members, if it is not in your job description to do that, remind staff, don't do it. Getting involved with inmates, gossiping about other staff with inmates or in front of inmates, or complaining about supervisors or your job in front of inmates. These are all things that could create problems. So we've also discussed, and I'll say it again, just as factors in our personal lives cause us to be vulnerable at any given point in time, during these times we can be susceptible to manipulation by inmates. So we should keep that in mind. So now let's turn our attention to some of the factors which could make you vulnerable. This is not an all-inclusive list, but it's intended to help you understand that there are some things that could happen to you as an employee or to your coworkers that put them in a position of compromise, that create stress for them in their personal lives, and those things will come to bear where they show up at work and their attention is not fully on their work. They include such things as financial difficulties. And I'll include in that because we've heard this many times, financial difficulties that come because they have a gambling habit, for example. And this is a fairly new thing with the proliferation of all of the gambling access that people have. Divorce, separation, or marital problems. Death of a family member. Feeling lonely or isolated. Working in close quarters with inmates. Job dissatisfaction. Now, some of you might be saying, Well, I've had one or more of these things happen to me. Maybe you have. Maybe your support system was there for you. Maybe you have a higher tolerance for some things. Just as we've discussed some of the factors in our personal lives that may make us vulnerable, we know that everybody is not going to react to the stresses in their lives in the same way. So let's take a look at some additional issues. Being different or being rejected by other staff. We have a variety of age groups and religious backgrounds and other cultural recognition within our staff groups, and they bring with them certain values, and each of us is different, and so we cannot judge by a set standard. Being new on the job, low self-esteem for our personal lives. One of the things we found out in working with these many agencies across the country is that many of our staff, or some of our staff really, have some of the same issues in their background, and they're not things that we test for before we employ them. So if staff come to us with some of the same issues, they may have had victimization in their lives, and that could be showing up as being overly sympathetic to the population, or it could be one where they say, gee, I survived this experience. Maybe we should just be hard on them to show that we are not going to be compromising. Not enforcing rules. This one is a big one. Most of the men that I have talked to coming to work with women for the first time are concerned that they could be falsely accused because just for no reason. And I tell them, if you follow policy, and one of the examples they give is a woman might show up in my office and she's not properly clothed. And I will say to them, what is your policy about being properly clothed? She may have a legitimate issue that you need to address, but you say to her, first of all, follow policy. Go get properly dressed, and then we'll talk about your emergency. The absence of that starts to create a boundary erosion because she may think that she is getting your attention because of how she looks or how she's dressed. And finally, lack of training. So now we're going to discuss some questions that you can ask yourself to do a self-check regarding maintaining professional boundaries.
Sue, before you do the self-check, can I interject something here?
Absolutely.
What I would like to interject is Dr. Susan Jones, who I'm proud to say was a graduate of our Executive Women's Leadership Program, did some research on boundary violations. And if you don't remember anything else, remember that this is not always about an individual failure. The agency has an obligation to ensure that the expectations are in policy. That's number one. But we also have to look at the environment that you work in on a daily basis in terms of how much it supports you as an individual to be able to do your job and to be able to report and to get the training. But again, I want to emphasize, as she did in her report, that we cannot continue to attribute this issue to just an individual failure. Thank you.
Okay. You know, one of the things that occurred to me while I was listening to Evelyn is that talking about personal relationships and professional boundaries is sometimes difficult for staff to do. It's kind of just like when you maybe have to have that conversation about sex with your children. We know it's an important conversation, but we're uncomfortable doing it. And failure to do so can have dire consequences in both cases. If new employees don't understand some of the pitfalls and warning signs, they may feel it's only happening to them. And we know in a correctional environment, we're not likely to step up and say, oh, I'm having this problem and be ostracized by our peers if no one else is having it. I hope that's resonating with you because we saw that in a lot of cases. So it's not just training, it's making sure that we give staff the right tools and orientation. So now we're going to move on to this tool that you can use to assist you. A lot of times we hear in agencies where staff say, well, gee, we don't have enough money and we don't have enough training time for this. And so this is a tool that was developed by one of the wardens in California, and it's been utilized now throughout the country. And these questions are questions that an individual can ask themselves to sort of see if there may be a problem beginning to occur. So I'll take a moment to read a couple of them, but I also want to let you know that this tool can be obtained from the PREA Resource Center, and at the end of this presentation, you're going to be given an opportunity to find that link where you can get to their site. So the first one is, do you look forward to seeing a particular inmate when you come to work? And these are all yes or no answers. Have you done anything with an inmate you would not want your family or your supervisor to know about? And this is kind of like the ethics question, you know? Would you be reluctant to have a coworker observe your behavior for the whole day? And so you can see from these questions, they start to get at what you personally are feeling. And if you start to feel some of these things, it doesn't mean that there's a problem yet. It means maybe you should take steps to find out how to manage your feelings around this area. It also means that this may not be the right environment for you to work in if this is troublesome to you. I have had employees come to me and say, I don't think this is a good place for me to work. And I've helped them move to another environment. So it's important for us to have this self-check and to utilize it to give staff the tools to sort of evaluate what they might be feeling. So let's talk about what if you answered yes to any of these questions. Professional boundaries in relationships can be really, really stressful and difficult. But again, they're not set in black and white. So if you question your professional boundaries with an inmate or you feel uncomfortable with their actions or advances towards you, talk to another person before it gets out of control. Make sure you reinforce that with staff every opportunity you get. It is important to address your concerns if you answered yes. Utilize employee assistance. Many years ago, we added the employee assistance component to the discussion because we found that many of our agencies had employee assistance programs, but they were only on the referral of a supervisor. And we encourage agencies to make sure that staff have an avenue to address concerns that they have. All of those things we talked about, divorce, money issues, whatever, if we don't deal with those, we have a group of staff who are potentially vulnerable, and that's going to create problems for us. Seek guidance from a supervisor or seek professional help or from a trusted source. These are all important. So now it's time to hear from you about what are some of the behaviors that you may have observed that you think crossed or blurred professional lines.
So here is a chat activity for you, and for those of you in groups, we'd like for you to convert and then post your answers in chat. What behaviors have you seen in facilities or in your setting that blurred or crossed professional boundaries? So we'd like for you to chat your responses to that question there on the screen. What behaviors have you seen in facilities or in your setting that blurred or crossed professional boundaries? So chat your responses. So Evelyn, what kind of themes are we seeing in our responses? And we're getting a lot of them.
Well, if I could interject, it looks like there are a lot of great examples of things. One of the things when we do a live training session with people is we ask, if you saw some of these behaviors, you know, would you confront it? Or have you known anyone who was walked off of the grounds, in other words, terminated, because they became involved with an inmate? And people say yes. And then they say, I knew they were going to be fired because, and they fill in the blanks in different ways, but I want you to think about this. The things they tell us are some of the things you're writing here. They saw people at the beginning of their career do things, or they saw people in the middle of their career doing things, or they saw people routinely doing the same kinds of things that you're writing about. And my question to them is, what did you do about it then? Not waiting at the back end and saying, I knew they were going to be fired because. So it's really important for us to take action when we see it at the beginning. And a couple of you said that. Evelyn?
Yeah, and I know we do have to keep the pace going. And so, again, some of this, when we look at how we post people where they are alone with inmates too often, or we put people in a position where they have not been trained around these issues, this is some of what you see. So we're just glad to see, and everybody can read them. And just like Sue said, these are the things we're probably going to get to in a minute. Our red flags.
Okay. Thank you. So here's some things to look for. We call them red flags. I'm not going to read all of them, but I am going to point out those that are in red because they represent some of the things that we see very, very often. Spending time with a particular staff on the inmate's behalf. And we've broken these down into inmate behavior, staff behavior, and things in the environment to look for. Using staff members' first name, we talked about that. Defending or interceding on behalf of an inmate. We've heard staff say, my inmate so-and-so and so-and-so. No, they're not your inmates. They are wards of the state or the county, and you don't own them, and so therefore you shouldn't even be referring to them in that way or particularly trying to defend them or intercede, especially if it is not in your job description. Working overtime, and not just working overtime, but in a specific area all the time or only in a specific area where certain inmates are. Let's look at some others. Changes in appearance. We talked about that a little bit with the employee who had a divorce and then who started changing his or her appearance when they come to work. And this could also be the same issue with the inmate population if they begin to show up more in their work area, dressed a certain way, and atypical from the way that they used to dress. So it's important to remember that these are not the only signs. They just represent some of the more frequent factors that we have associated with cases of boundary violations. And, excuse me, if checked early on and when it's observed, we can assist our coworkers in maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. So I want you to take a moment and think about the dynamics of a relationship that you may or may be aware of, wherein a inmate and staff relationship, inappropriate relationship has occurred or developed. So just take a second and think about that, and then I'm going to ask you a question. All right, here's the question. In that relationship, who is the victim and who has the power? I'm going to ask you to respond to who is the victim in that scenario. And you can use the chat process to do that.
And we've got lots of responses coming in. And what are you seeing there in the responses, Evelyn? I'm seeing a pattern.
Yeah, I am. And again, proud of this group because they do understand who is the victim and who has the power. Go ahead, Sue.
And I think it's really important for you to reinforce this with staff because when we do this exercise, sometimes people say staff, the inmate has the power and staff is the victim, or sometimes it could be both. And the reason they say that is because, quote, inmates manipulate. And you may be doing well on this test by saying that, but you need to make sure your staff hear that the inmate is always the victim. We cannot say someone manipulated us and we participated, and then we go back and say, we are professionals and we always have to maintain that professionalism. So regardless of what the inmate does or how they show up, we have the power. The inmate is always the victim. Just a couple of things I want you to keep in mind here. Even if the agency has good policies, training, and orientation, there are some staff that you're going to work with who still view it as acceptable to engage in inappropriate relationships. That may be their personal value system or their belief that because inmates were sexually active on the streets that this is not a problem. It is a problem, and we need to say that to them. Some inmates and parolees, as we mentioned, have a history of victimization, and they may see that they cannot say no to a person in a position of power. That's a point you need to reinforce with staff. Once in a relationship, an employee's personal judgment may become clouded and they make bad decisions. Even in good relationships, when they end, they don't end well. And as a result, let's just say, for example, the person who's getting divorced may make up with their family member. Now they don't want the relationship with the inmate that they started. Guess what? Somebody's going to be mad in that scenario, and it's not going to end well. And we don't ever know when sexual or amorous relationships between an inmate and parolee are going to occur, but they're never a secret. So even if an employee thinks that it's going well, there's someone else who is observing that behavior, and they may tell on staff and compromise you. So let staff know, make these points. It is not going to be a secret, and it could cause you a problem. So what if you are okay with this, but what happens if one of your coworkers is demonstrating some of this behavior? If you notice a coworker who's demonstrating some of the signs we discussed, depending on the severity of the behaviors, you can either talk to them or you can tell a supervisor or management about what you suspect. You have a duty to report. It seems like common sense, but in the press of doing business, sometimes this gets lost. If you suspect sexual abuse, you must report it. So what are some things that we can do to protect ourselves from this situation? Here's some prevention strategies. We've said this many times, and we'll continue to reinforce it. Follow policy. That seems simple. And not just follow policy, but make sure you're clear about what your policy says. I mentioned the example of the touch policy. Align yourself with other employees. Show respect for them. Don't disrespect your coworkers, particularly in front of inmates. You shouldn't do it anyhow, but particularly in front of inmates. Do not discuss your personal life or that of other employees in front of inmates. No first name familiarity. Recognize overly friendly inmates. Manipulation starts when someone shows up and they act inappropriately, not just violating policy, but just doing things that you think might be a little out of touch with where they should be. Hold people accountable every single time. Never accept gifts, letters, or phone calls. Never give out your phone number or address. Talk with other staff when you see warning signs. I mentioned, don't wait till the back end of their career and say, oh, gee, I knew they were not going to make it because. Approach them in good faith, not judgmentally. You don't know what may be going on with them. Don't let them fall off the cliff and then tell everybody, I could have told you that was going to happen. So let's look at some other things that you can do. Recognize your stress level based on the things that we talked about that could create a problem. Don't do favors. Do not ignore inappropriate or deliberate behavior. Have pride in the job that you have undertaken. And remember, your family, community, and your agency, this can be an outstanding career for you and your coworkers. You can be the change in charge of your own destiny. Don't be reluctant to share or ask for advice. We know that we've spent a lot of time talking about the pitfalls, but I want to share with you that there are an awful lot of people who have successfully navigated this culture and done so without harming their careers. And we hope that some of the things that we've talked about in this session have given you some food for thought. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sue. So now is the time for your questions. So now is the time to post your questions for us into chat. So I have a question. Here's the first one. Can you ever trust an inmate? Can you ever trust an inmate? Get us started.
Leslie, this is Evelyn. Did you want a response from that?
Yeah, actually, that was a question somebody asked.
People need to write this down. Every inmate doesn't lie, and not every staff member tells the truth. It's not a question of trust. It's a question of your obligation to be accountable for their safe, secure, and humane conditions that you hold them under. What would you be trusting them to do within your job function? So you have a job that should be adequately described in policy. The inmate has a charge based on the conditions of confinement. It's not a matter of whether you trust the inmate. It's whether or not you do your job to be accountable. So remember, every inmate doesn't lie, and every staff member doesn't tell the truth.
So, thank you, Evelyn. Here's another question. What should you say to a coworker who is discussing their weekend or other intimate conversations or things with an inmate?
I think it's important to let them know what your policy guidelines are. Always we should be referring back to policy because that is the standard. And you might also want to preface your conversation by saying, here's what I observed and why you are making the effort to share this with them. The important thing to remember is it's not the reporting of the information that's important, meaning telling on behavior that you see. It's the employee's conduct that usually gets them in trouble. So if you can put the conduct in check, then you eliminate the other part of it. So I think it's important to express concern, to say another way to handle this might be, if it's a problem, and then move on from there. But let them know that you want them to be successful, and from your experience, that's not something that should be done. That's just fair warning.
Right. Here's another question. And this is an interesting question. How proactive are agencies being towards providing an active support network of peers for staff to call upon in the event of need when something like this arises around undue familiarity? From the both of you's experience, both Evelyn and Susan.
Well, I can't speak from an agency standpoint across the country. What I can tell you is that there are some cultures that we have seen where progressive discipline exists, where people go out of their way, management does, to expressly provide opportunities for staff to have dialogue like we're having. One of the things that I always found interesting is when we go out and travel, even if we're doing a review, we have focus groups and talk to staff, and staff always tell us they appreciate us taking the time to talk to them, and they say no one has. And so I would just caution, if you're a manager or a supervisor on the line, to make the time to talk with your staff about critical issues and then have progressive discipline. If someone they answered yes to one of those questions and they come to you, they have not yet perhaps crossed a boundary. They are salvageable as an employee. They're self-aware. So make sure that the penalty fits the crime. But if it continues the pattern, then you need to take progressive discipline.
All right, here's a great question. What do you do when an inmate tells you what another inmate says about staff and it's inappropriate, but they don't want to snitch on their cellmate?
You need to tell the inmate that there's no confidentiality in if a crime has occurred or a violation has occurred, you have an obligation to report. So they need, if they tell you that information, you need to let them know that it's going to be reported.
All right, thanks, Sue. Here's a great question, and this is the what advice do you have for giving training to senior officers on these type of issues?
I think we can recognize their expertise in having been at the job for a while. But if you observe behaviors that you think fall outside of good practice, I think that's what you say. I appreciate that you've been here for a while, because we have seen across the board that it isn't just new employees that get in trouble. It's people who have become complacent over time. So it's important to recognize that and use the fact that you want to ensure that they get a chance to retire with a successful career history, and that you've noticed there have been some things that maybe they need to pay attention to. So always you can take a proactive approach. And if the behavior continues, you let them know what is going to happen.
Right.
And I'd like to comment on that, because I think part of what this person is getting at too is we have staff who've been around a long time before a number of policies, not just this one, were in test, and they established relationships to get things done. And so we've set standards that in some cases do not align now with policy. So it's probably even more important to try to get them to understand, as Sue said, there are now ramifications associated with certain things that maybe they were not before. And so if they understand the legal lens to that, I think it'll be easier to implement. Leslie, can I comment on something that somebody posted?
Absolutely.
Because I think it's important. We have a post up here where somebody says, well, we are always giving information about ourselves to inmates. Having photographs of our spouses, children, and family members on our desk gives inmates information about us. Wearing a wedding ring gives inmates information about us. We're not saying they're not going to know some things. What we're saying is how you respond if they try to get personal about it. So, yeah, you see I have a ring on, but you don't have a right to ask me anything about it. And that's when you shut it down. You keep them on task with the reason that they're standing before you. And I don't care what you have in your office. Yeah, they see it, but guess what? It's not their business. Don't engage.
And you're right, Evelyn. They can make an inference about a ring, for example. I wear a band that belongs to my mother. It doesn't mean I'm married. So unless I tell somebody that, they can make any inference that they want unless I'm around talking about it. So that's an excellent point.
And we've got time for, I believe, 2 more questions, and this is a really good question. Do you address this topic differently for probation and parole staff working in the community?
Well, I think most of what we're talking about is I don't want to use the term common sense because I really don't like to say that, but I think it's practical in terms of the communication, the standards in terms of each agency is going to have about what kinds of relationships can form. And as we've gone around the country, for example, there are differing standards about when you can have a relationship with an inmate, for example. We've seen in some counties where people actually go out and can get married after a certain period of time, whereas within a facility that's not an issue. So I think it's important to recognize that the baseline issues are absolutely the same, the discussion of personal issues, the not becoming complacent, the only performing those duties that fall within the scope of your job. And so they're pretty much going to be the same.
It just might be maybe the situations in which they play out and the settings might differ.
And certainly the awareness about personal stresses and vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to point out that the power is the same. The influence over the inmate's ability to have something or get something or have something taken from them is the same, that power base.
Yeah, the probation or the parolee in that case.
Leslie, I see a comment that says in Wyoming that the male staff are dealt with more harshly. I think that's an evolving issue that under the PREA standards, we are now seeing a change in that, and I don't know where your agency falls on that scale, but women employees are now being held to the same standards. It used to be in many agencies they were allowed to resign, they were seen as the victim, but that is not the case anymore. The standards under PREA hold male and female staff accountable, so if your agency is doing that, it's maybe something they need to take a look at.
So there's lots, I think there's only a couple of questions on here that we did not get to. One in which, and I think it's more of a policy-related issue related to the differences in generations, and do younger generations have a tendency to look at policy and procedure differently and act on it differently? That's one I think that might be interesting no matter what topic we're looking at. But as we come to the top of the hour, I just want to say, Evelyn, closing comments for us.
Yes. So this was just a